I'll turn to you now, Gisela, to kick things off. Thank you.
I think the broad context of looking at the review is it's useful to remind ourselves how this government came into being. In the sense, most prime ministers and cabinets, when they take over, will have emerged out of election campaigns which required them to form party manifestos, have views on a whole range of things. This one didn't. It emerged out of what some people regarded the actions of a group of insurgents who delivered the referendum result. And I see the integrated review as a result of two things: a government that finally coalesces around key ideas which will determine their functions. And the second, and that makes me feel rather old, it feels terribly Blairite. If I go back to the last really comprehensive review, which was successful, people arguably would say it would have been George Robertson's review in the late 90s. And what always strikes me is that Tory governments tend to be focusing on managing decline, whereas Labour governments, who are much more outward looking and internationalist. And this paper is a combination of both. It is outward looking, but not in a managing decline sense. It does put domestic issues at the heart of its delivery. And that's why I think the work BFPG has done for considerable time before it was official government policy, that foreign policy is a domestic issue and has to fit in with these issues. I think the review epitomizes in that sense. And I think we have to see the defense white paper when we see it also in that context. And just one of the things which struck me at the weekend when the story was trailed about the maritime support for the protection of the international cables in the Atlantic, it kind of brings together a realization of that geography comes before history, and then history and geography ultimately always matter in as you look ahead. So the geography that we're an island is undeniable and uncontestable. Historically, a lot of the cables which are really important go back to Victorian cable network. And therefore, our response must be that if we think technology is important, if this is where our geography is, and whether there's something where we've got a historic position, we must focus on that. And I would also just add one other caution, as well as in history and geography shaping politics. The next issue is that whether you quote Eisenhower, who said plans don't matter and planning is essential, or Mike Tyson, who says you have a plan and then someone punches you in the face. This is a starting point of outlining principles which shape your views. This government is facing two extremely turbulent events, one of its choosing, i.e. Brexit, and one not of its choosing, but global and unavoidable, and that is COVID. And therefore, I see that integrated review of also realization that all the government departments, their functions have to, on a lateral basis, work together in order to completely, fully utilize the assets we have. So I regard the bringing together of international development and the Foreign Office, not just as a merging of two departments, but as a new strategic approach. So what I would say about this integrated review, it is not ideologically driven in that sense, other than it defines core national interests, which is sovereignty, security, prosperity. It puts technology at its heart. And quite frankly, I think technology will be where the competitive advantages or disadvantages will be played out. And it is a comprehensive recognition of our place in history. I just think it's it really cheers me that finally we're, 30 years on, we're kind of pulling all the strands together and recognize that you cannot have a defense strategy unless you've sorted out what your foreign policy is, unless you sorted out where you domestically want to go. And I think that is beginning to deliver that.
Thank you so much, Gisela. And there's a couple of things in there that really struck me that I hope we can circle back to as well. I think this framing around decline and the role that perceptions of decline, this is such a strong narrative and a point of contestation within Westminster about how we should frame and I suppose level with and reconcile with our ambitions and strengths and weaknesses and so on. And that's obviously something that's been approached with a very delicate balance in the review. I have to say I was personally quite struck at this rather somber and humble tone expressed within the review. So let's circle back to that. And also I think this very important point about geography and the role that that plays within the review. But for now, I'll hand over to Simon.
First thing to say is it's very difficult to produce these sorts of reviews in government. It's a hugely complex operation. And so I'll start by saying that I think this is a very credible and serious review, a valuable review with a lot of good material in it. And having said that, I think the two things that I bring out are actually, if it was billed as a radical overhaul of British foreign policy, I'm not sure it really is. There's an awful lot of continuity in it, and I'll come back to that. And secondly, I do think there's one issue in it where it falls down, and that is in failing really to address the future of the relationship with the EU, both bilaterally and in terms of our cooperation with the EU on international issues. That seems to me to be a gap, perhaps surprisingly, still not yet filled. But those are my sort of top line comments. I mean, I think obviously there's always a lot of political rhetoric in a review like this. There is in this one as well. But as I say, if you strip that away, there's a lot of serious thinking, as Gisela has said, about the future, about integrating domestic and international policy and so forth. The geopolitical analysis that underpins it is really quite sober, talking about a contested and competitive world, one in which we have to compete to succeed. Actually, I'd slightly disagree with Gisela in that, actually that is very different from the Blairite view of liberal interventionism. It's a more cautious, more sort of hard-headed approach to the world. As for continuity, the point is, if you look at the review overall, it seems to me that it paints a picture of British foreign policy, which is quite a familiar one, a policy with global reach, projecting the specific character of this country, committed to the values of liberal democracy, quite a lot of talk about soft power. Those are familiar things, as indeed is the material on the relationship with the United States. Some people have been surprised by how prominent that is. Personally, I'm not, because I think it's right. And also because I think, given what's happening in relations with the EU and China, it was very likely that there would be a heavy focus on the US. The focus on European and Euro-Atlantic security is familiar policy. The importance of NATO and Britain's role in NATO is emphasized. All that is familiar. If you look at the big issue, which was sort of advertised, the so-called Indo-Pacific tilt in British foreign policy, we can come back to that. Actually, if you read the review carefully, I think that is less of a major shift than a sort of step change in existing policy. Certainly when I was in the Foreign Office, we were already shifting the focus of economic and diplomatic, and indeed to some extent security activity to that region. So I don't think that's a huge shift, but it's definitely a step change. And on China, one of the things I was looking out for was what's the language on China going to be like? How adversarial is the language on China going to be? And in fact, it's not very, actually, it's really quite cautious. It talks about finding the balance between economic engagement, protecting security, and respecting our values in language that's really, I thought, rather more European than American. So that was very interesting. So those are some areas where there's perhaps less change than you think. I think, however, I agree with Gisela that it's really interesting in the way it focuses on integration of policy across government, domestic and international, the way in which it looks at modern instruments of foreign policy through technology and science, really puts the focus on that. And then calling out climate change as the top issue. I mean, that may not be surprising, but it's new. And of course, that links to the broader agenda of British foreign policy that I think we'd expect this year around sustainability, international health policy, the relationship with nature, all of which I think will be big in the G7 presidency and of course the COP presidency, and they're important themes here. So, you know, that there is new material there, and there is a new orientation, a forward-looking orientation. But just to finish on my point about the EU, I think that is a bit the elephant in the room. The review confirms that the government sees Europe through the lenses of NATO and bilateral relationships. And there are references inserted to cooperating with the EU where our interests coincide, and on trade. And of course, we've had some very bad trade statistics recently. But I don't think the review yet answers the question of how Britain is going to exert influence in the world on all the things it wants to in a competitive environment between the US and China, if we can't find a way of aligning effectively with the European Union. So I think that's still a challenge ahead. And very final comment, it's a bit stronger on aspiration and analysis than on delivery and planning. But as we know, there is a series of papers to come out now on different aspects of this review, starting today with the defence paper, which should help us understand the roadmap for the way ahead.
Thank you so much, Simon. And I agree that this is, you know, I think to some degree, this was probably always going to be a vision document. It's a statement of kind of a strategic framework. The implementation is what begins now. I think it's probably to some degree the fact that this has taken such a long time to be developed and produced and articulated since the referendum that there does feel a bit of an urgency around needing to see that roadmap for implementation as soon as we can. I just want to pivot first back to this question of geography, because this is something you have both mentioned. Gisela, you described this document as sort of Blairite, but of course, you know, Tony Blair has made no, secret of the fact that he believes that fundamentally the best strategic framework for the exertion and expression of British power and influence in the world is through the European Union and through our membership of that. We've obviously left, we expected that the review would very much focus on European regional security through the NATO framework, through emphasizing some bilateral relationships. But as Simon says, you know, it doesn't really provide any substantive detail about our intentions. I would say the flip side to that, in terms of our EU relationship, is that, of course, the EU itself is still in relatively early stages of working out what its role and ambitions are as a foreign policy actor and how that can practically work. So I'd like to hear from you both about your thoughts on this specifically. I mean, there was a conscious decision to separate the future foreign policy and security relationship from the trade negotiations in Brexit. To some degree, that's probably been a good thing in that there's now space for it's not toxified like that trade conversation was. And certainly our polling suggests that there's an appetite amongst the British people for that conversation. But Gisela, do you think that it was the right thing to do to separate that out? And do you think it is acceptable and understandable that there isn't more on the future UK-EU relationship in this document, given these are our closest neighbours?
Well, I always thought that when it comes to discussions on foreign policy and defence, that given that this was the one area when you looked at where real progress was made, was always in bilateral relationships, and that the problem with the European Union's defence stance has always been a lack of capacity. It's always been high in aspirations, but very low in how it could actually deliver, or to what extent it even was prepared to deliver in many ways. I think it was the right decision to have made, but I just want to put a little thought in your head, looking ahead, because it's all very well writing these papers, and then reality hits, and at that stage, unless you have the means to affect anything, your aspirations are pointless. I always found that when you talk about foreign policy and you wanted to have a real row with the Germans, you didn't actually talk about the EU, you talked about Russia. And when we talk about NATO, which will not just for us, but also for the European Union be the major delivery of European and North Atlantic security, the lack of leadership on that one, which of course we now don't know how President Biden will respond. And he was very revealing how President Biden's view of Nord Stream was by far more conciliatory than people thought. And this is the contentious bit. The kind of vexatious thought I want to put in your head is, how do you think European foreign policy will work out if suddenly the Sputnik vaccine is perceived to have saved Germany from COVID, and how that affects it? So I'm just saying, I think they were wise not to go into details in that particular relationship. You have to have broad principles, because I think the next few months and years may well throw up some rather unexpected events.
Yes, I agree to some extent. You know, I think there is this huge degree of heterogeneity in the EU member states' own policies on some of these core issues of the day. So the idea of there being a cohesive foreign policy amongst the European Union specifically, you know, is still some way away yet. But Simon, you mentioned that you would have liked to have seen more. I mean, how would you have liked to have seen the UK-EU relationship expressed within the integrated review? And sorry, just before you come to that, I would just draw everyone's attention. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for our panelists, please do put them in there while we're talking, and we will come to you as soon as we can. So Simon, how would you have liked to see the UK-EU relationship expressed in the document?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, just to say, I'm not trying to reopen, you know, the Brexit argument. This is a post-Brexit document. You know, I fully accept that, and it's looking to the future. But there are two aspects of this that I think, you know, need to be developed. The first is, you know, we are the bilateral political relationship between the UK and the EU at the moment is bad. Now, obviously, vaccine is a big part of that, but obviously also there is sort of hangover from Brexit. And we've got to find a way, it seems to me, of getting through that and building a sort of cooperative relationship. These are liberal democracies in Europe. They're our biggest trading partners. They are people who share our values, and therefore they are important in the sort of spectrum of relationships that we need for British foreign policy. And the idea that there's sort of something that's global Britain and Europe is something other than global, I think is something we've got to get over as we come out of the Brexit debate. So we've got to have the bilateral relationship. But the other side of it is this is not just about conventional foreign and defense policy. Indeed, one of the big themes of this review is that in future, international relations are going to be vectored through things like tech regulation, scientific cooperation, and so forth. And those are areas in which the European Union collectively, through common policies, has global weight. You might say almost as much as the US and China. And therefore, we've got to think in an intelligent way about how we're going to leverage that European weight behind the aspirations for British influence that are set out in this document. And that's what I'm saying we need to think through further. You know, the new nature of international relations is one in which I think the UK is going to want to find itself aligning with the other Europeans on a number of issues.
Very interesting. Let's come to another big bilateral relationship question, which is, of course, China. We've touched on this a little bit. I think there was a degree of surprise around the way in which China was presented within the document, although I would say there was quite a high degree of, if not coordination, correlation with the way in which it was being expressed by Tony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, presenting China as a competitor, collaborator, and adversary as a kind of simultaneous framework. And I think we saw quite a lot of that in the review. But of course, not everybody's happy with this. There has been a growing sense of alarm in Westminster, particularly over the past 18 months, about the extent of our potential vulnerabilities to China. My feeling is that China was actually very present in a lot of aspects of the review, probably rather as more of an implicit force. I think I see a lot of the influence and the need to kind of respond to China in the integration framework domestically, and also in the way in which we've presented the Indo-Pacific tilt. We don't explicitly say this is to directly challenge China, but this is a lot of the ambitions expressed within that would actually go some way to sort of balancing regional security and economic flows. So Simon and Gisela, what do you think about the way in which China was presented in this? It was a risk. There is a political cost to these types of positions. Gisela, how do you think that this issue about China is going to work its way through Westminster and Whitehall over the coming years? And do you think this framework was the right approach in terms of allowing enough flexibility, openness, but also making sure that we're safeguarding our security?
Apologies, being slow, I'm muting myself. I come back to when you quoted Blinken, Sophia, he's a competitor, collaborator, and adversary. And in that sense, it's very different from our approach to Russia, which I think is in some sense a disruptor and is a threat to us. But in terms of its size of economy is by far lower down the scale. And if you go back as to, is it 2048 when on current projection, China will be the world's largest economy? And I think you have to have a realistic approach to that. The only way you can live with China as a global force is if you, I think, first of all, recognize that China has learned I never talk about China these days on these things. I talk about the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has learned one thing from the experience of the Soviet Union, is that internal weakness leads to fragmentation, and you end up with what happened to the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. And they're not going to allow this to happen. And that's why they regard a lot of things as internal matters. At the same time, they're advancing technologically. And if we think that the way of the future is in terms of technological advance, there comes the kind of the Henry Kissinger question of, could you actually stop them? And the answer is, no, you can't. All you can do is hope to be ahead of them. And that takes you to the question of the global regulation. And that's why I think Simon's point was a very, very important one. The foreign policy heft of global rules and regulations and setting those rules. And there I think Europe and the US have to start working together. It's not going to be an either or. And that's where the United Kingdom will be important in response to China, but not being starry-eyed about the real threats in terms of security China focuses on. But the only way you can deal with that is actually find ways of working with China. It is too big, it is too important and too significant to try and just ignore it or say, we will not deal with you.
Simon, how do you feel about the framing of China within the integrated review? Were you surprised, or do you feel that this was something that felt inevitable? And are you surprised by the degree of cohesion with the way in which the United States has presented its desired future relationship with China? Because obviously the nature of UK-China relations is fundamentally different to the sort of great power rivalry that we see between the United States and China. Do you think it's a good thing that we're coordinating and we'll be able to sort of align ourselves quite closely with the United States on this? Or do you think it's natural that our paths will diverge over the coming years?
Well, first of all, I very much agree with you that China permeates this review in terms of the geopolitical analysis, in terms of the focus on the importance of integration of domestic and international policy in order to be effective and competitive in the world, and also in this whole question of how you balance security and economic interests going forward. And that's a huge challenge. China is at the heart of it. So I welcome the fact that there's a lot of serious thinking going into that, because I think it's it's the biggest challenge for government going forward in terms of international relations. How are we going to strike the balances that we have to face? And I was a bit surprised, to be honest with you, by the language, which I thought was slightly less adversarial than I would have expected. I take your point about it being aligning with the American posture of the new administration up to a point, but actually the words chosen about strategic competition, I think, were also those of the European Union. So it's interesting, and it struck me as being slightly less adversarial, certainly, than a lot of the language on the backbenches of the Conservative Party at the moment, the China Research Group. So this raises a very interesting question of how the government's going to take this forward. But I welcome the fact that the review actually seems to me to set out the basis, the opportunity to thrash this out in a way that needs to happen in government. But government needs to have mechanisms that enable it to make the very difficult choices that lie ahead in terms of the balance of our economic interest in cooperation with China, but the absolute necessity to preserve our security interests in all these new fields like cyber and others that the review identifies, and of course to factor in the really important values questions which are coming to the fore now, particularly in relation to human rights issues in China. So I welcome it, but I think it's the start of the next chapter, of a really important chapter of focusing on elaborating the China policy.
I agree. I tend to think that there's been a lot of criticism about the review in terms of sort of quick reactions, that it didn't sort of come down very clearly on a few aspects which felt ambiguous and so on. And that to some degree it was presenting a lot of the risks and challenges, but not saying, focusing on the hard choices we were going to have to take. But I would probably contend that I think the flexible nature of this review is actually part of its DNA, and I think probably reflects the sense that things are going to be evolving quite dynamically over the coming 5 years, let alone the next 10. So let's turn to an aspect that's obviously very central to the BFPG's mission, which is this intersection between the domestic and the international. We've been championing for some time the idea that we need to think in a much more holistic way about our resilience, and particularly that we want to see levelling up and global Britain coming together and working hand in hand. Therefore, extremely pleasing for us to see this really novel emphasis that is placed within this integrated review. I mean, obviously you have to take decisions about the scope of the review. There are some aspects that I think probably could have been in there, like higher education. But, to some degree, it is really pioneering in the way in which it's bringing these together. How optimistic are we that this can actually work in practice? What are some of the obstacles and opportunities that we're going to see in trying to merge our domestic and international policy? And, what would we, on the flip side, like to be seeing from the levelling up agenda that actually helps us to achieve our foreign policy objectives? Technology has been highlighted as possibly the core of the intersection between the two, but I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about how this might work in practice, what some of the challenges we might encounter along the way, and how optimistic we are that we can really bring people along on this agenda and help them to feel that they have a stake in our foreign policy and our role in a globalized world. So Gisela, I know this is an issue close to your heart, so let's start with you.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems on this one is actually our elected politicians, in the sense that, for 20 years when I was an MP and I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Defense Committee, and then I used to literally hide from the voters when I was flying off to Afghanistan to do things, because they just always assumed that, being an airport must be a jolly and a junket. And we go out and get ourselves elected on the basis that you got the rubbish collected, the potholes filled, and the hedges cut. And I think we've gone through a long period of where the political discourse between big, difficult decision making and what we tell our voters of what we're delivering, has sort of suffered from that. So I think the challenge for the government is to start to learn a new language. And if I just use as an example, which is a historic one, the fact that we get direct flights to India from a Birmingham airport is actually incredibly important for the West Midlands community. It was also very important for the number of Indian students our universities have got. But we've kind of never woven that into our local and domestic political conversations. And I think there's really quite a role for BFPG looking ahead, because I know government's just not very good at this kind of thing, is to actually help government to how to translate what look like just international decisions to a local and national implementation. And if I just think of having been a Birmingham MP, with the Commonwealth Games coming up, with what our universities are doing, with the hospitals, they're really big dimensions. And I think we as the politicians on this occasion need a little bit of help to translate the high level speak into electoral nuggets, which are true, helpful and relevant, but we just haven't got around to expressing them in that way.
Thank you, Gisela. And I mean, I think it's obviously just such important context that this review is coming out of, a very revolutionary period in our politics and a huge sense of domestic upheaval. And so this is as much a project of domestic renewal as it is a piece of work about our foreign policy ambitions. Simon, how optimistic are you that this integration agenda can work in practice, and where do you see some of the potential pain points that might come along the way?
Well, first thing I want to say is I really, really welcome this. I mean, I was the permanent secretary in the business department before I was the permanent secretary in the Foreign Office. And I was one of the people in Whitehall a decade ago who was arguing we've got to integrate international policy more effectively with domestic policy and think about those linkages. And we've got to break down the barriers in Whitehall between the people who do foreign and the people who do domestic. So, if this can give more impetus to that, I really welcome it. And of course, it does matter, because things like how we compete internationally in technology, how we develop trade, it translates into jobs at home. It translates directly into the things that matter most to people in the country. And therefore, the task that BFPG has set itself to try to bring foreign policy home, I think is a really important one. In terms of the obstacles, there are some. First of all, there are the obstacles within Whitehall. The way that Whitehall is organized, the way that actually different secretaries of state and civil servants think about their role and breaking down barriers. There is obviously a question about resources. This is all very well, but you've got to have the resources to implement these policies, and you've got to share those resources between departments in Whitehall in the ways that work. And let's not forget, we are facing an acute economic problem post-COVID. So there isn't going to be a lot of money to splash around in pursuit of ambitious policies. That's going to be an issue. There are going to be other issues like the impact on supply chains of post-COVID, in the post-COVID world, and therefore the consequences for trade, and particularly as they affect small and medium enterprises in the supply chain environment, the trade environment, which has also been affected by Brexit, and which has a direct domestic impact and could very much affect, for example, those areas of the country most relevant to the levelling up agenda. So you can see, for me, you see direct impacts and correlations. And the other thing which has come out finally in this and is emphasised in the review is, of course, the future of the Union, of the United Kingdom, and how international policy is going to affect that through trading patterns, Brexit has obviously affected it, but also looking further forward in terms of our international outreach, and therefore the way that we can develop the domestic economy in different parts of the UK. All of these things matter. There are huge questions that have to be dealt with across government.
Yes, indeed, because of course we focus a lot on levelling up and global Britain as the kind of two core agendas of this government, and it is quite extraordinary just to even have two renewal projects of that scale happening simultaneously. But there's also two other projects, one being a sort of the green recovery and the other one being saving the union. So there's a lot on the plate of this government. I would probably contend that you could actually, all four of those can work quite well together, and we are doing a bit of research into that at the moment. But keeping within this frame of resources, and of course the other context of the review is the fact that there was meant to be a multi-year settlement going along with the publication of this review, but of course the pandemic its catastrophic effects on domestic finances have made that impossible. So I think that's also partly why there is this sort of lack of clear specificity about the roadmap at this stage. But we've had a very large number of questions through, and I'd like to start to turn to them. And many of these questions are about our aid and development policy. I think it was rather interesting that one of the sort of key stories, aside from the nuclear, increasing our nuclear stockpile last week when the review landed, was just this very strong focus on the reduction in our aid spending budget. That is a hoo-ha that I think will be playing out for quite some time. Obviously, we have taken a decision, the government's taken a decision to reduce our aid spending down from 0.7% of GNI down to 0.5% of GNI. Now, very interesting that the review itself in the Prime Minister's statement at the beginning actually committed to reinstating that in the future, but we don't have a clear sense of what the tests are for that to be reinstated. And so I think there is a bit of concern, and there are quite a few jittery people in the aid sector and community about where this is going to go in the future. Fact is, we remain one of the leading global donors and are still doing a huge amount of good work, including on COVAX, the vaccination scheme for the developing world. But it is true that this decision to reduce our aid commitment has had quite a significant cost, not least of all in terms of soft power, and seems to be a sort of focal point for concern in Westminster. How should we think about this moving forward? It seems that a huge degree of political capital has been expended on this reduction. At the same time, it feels like it was probably, we know it's something that has the backing of the British people. Where do you think the government should go on our aid and development spending from here? There is a positive case to be made about the work that we're doing, but this reduction seems to be hanging as a kind of, it's a load that we're going to carry for some time. We've had a huge integration agenda. That was the origins of the integration agenda, really was moving aid into our foreign policy. How do we think that we should be conceiving our aid and development spending as a core strategic element of our foreign policy moving forward? Are there any areas that you feel were not discussed in the review that you think should have been more closely emphasized? And how should we be making the case and telling the story about the importance of our aid and development spending moving forward to the British people? So there's a lot there, but we've had a lot of questions. I'm trying to bring as much together, so answer as much or as little as you can. Gisela, we'll start with you.
I think what we haven't said enough in the review is that I think we're going to have a real struggle on our hands of defending the virtues of liberal democracies. We have I think I was in a recent talk where Jeremy Hunt described this as the shining city on the hill. We've kind of assumed that, of course, given half a chance, the world will become a liberal democracy, and all we have to wait is just keep opening those doors, and the rest of the world will willingly walk through those gates and agree that this is the way to do things. So I think as well as what when we do aid, of supporting that. I think we have not spelled out sufficiently that I think the liberal democratic West as a whole has got a real challenge on its hand to articulate the virtues of the system. And I remember, and I can't remember how many years ago now, was BFPG did a paper where he compared the government spending on the Foreign Office, on DFID, and on the MOD. You know, and he has suddenly had this 2% target for defense. You had your 0.7 for DFID, and just simply not enough for the Foreign Office to allow it to be as strategic as I think it wanted to be. And what and Simon may know more about this, but I think there's still quite a debate going on within FCDO and within the government of the weighting between trade and aid in some sense. But what is called for is a more strategic, which doesn't get you to the position of where you give with one hand and take with the other. The numeric figures, I think, is I'm sort of sad that we ended up in this trap of arguing over whether it's 0.5 or 0.7. I mean, it's going to go down anyway because it's linked to gross national income. And what has been the problems have not been the headline figures. I think it has been the ability to align what the then Foreign Office was trying to do and their diplomatic reach and what we were trying to do with aid. And in terms of the integrated review, I think it has underestimated the challenge of just articulating the merits of being a liberal democracy when you've got a country like China that will just give you money without requesting human rights and all the other things. That is a bit of a gap in my view.
Interesting. Simon, you were obviously very involved in the FCO before it became the FCDO. How do you think that the FCDO is grappling with the challenges and opportunities that come from that integration agenda with our aid and development spending, and where would you like to see it going?
Well, first of all, I think it's very much in the spirit of this review, which I endorse, that we should be integrating not only between domestic and international, but we should be integrating the instruments of our the different instruments of our international policy. So I think aligning your diplomacy with your aid activity, with your trade policy, and indeed with your military and defence policy is right. And for that reason, I don't personally have a problem with the merger of DFID and the Foreign Office. I know some people found it uncomfortable. I don't. I think it's possible to align foreign policy and aid policy without making one the servant totally of the other and preserving the sort of objectives of aid policy. So I don't have a problem with that structure. Indeed, I'd like to see the Trade Department merged in with the FCDO, to be honest with you. I think that would be a logical next step, but let's leave that for now. On the cut, I regretted the cut. I think it was probably in the circumstances, almost inevitable. And I think clearly, in domestic politics, it works. And particularly, I think, I have to say, within the politics of the Conservative Party, I think there was a lot of support for that. So you can understand that it was driven by a number of motives. I think it's interesting that there's a very clear commitment to restore it, although, as you say, there's no timeline, but I welcome that. And, I think the government should be held to that. But I absolutely agree with Gisela. This, aid and development and our broader activity in that area is absolutely part of the values agenda of the liberal democratic international agenda, which we are espousing. I think it's really important part of that agenda I alluded to earlier for this country, which is around sort of health, environment, climate, development. These are areas of policy which sort of are interconnected, and our aid effort is very important. And the fact that we've given so much to the World Health Organization and we've been so active on COVAX is really welcome there. So, I think we should maintain it. I think it's an important part of what we do. I hope that we'll be able to restore the levels. And, the other point of this is, frankly, let's not be naive about it. Of course, it's necessary and good in and of itself, but it's also part of the way in which we compete for hearts and minds across the world in continents like Africa, where China, a geopolitical competitor, as is now described, is very active in promoting its influence. So, that's another reason why we should not reduce it and not lose sight of it.
Yes, I completely agree. The question about where trade will end up, I think, has been one of the sort of great mysteries of the last few years in Westminster. We hypothesize, I think, at the BFPG that if the Australian model, which was so carefully studied for the integration of DFID into the FCO, trade is obviously also sitting under their foreign department. So that may be where it goes. I think the fact that trade was not called out in the title of the integrated review, and yet is actually described in the review as the heart of global Britain, I think says so much about how thinking has been shifting internally on trade, and does suggest it might be going that direction. So we've had a lot of questions about the pandemic, the vaccine spats that are going on, vaccine nationalism. We've also had quite a few questions about the United States. I want to sort of bring them together. It strikes me that the pandemic obviously arrived at a time when the West and the kind of traditional liberal alliance was in quite a bit of strife. And there was an opportunity perhaps to leverage the pandemic as a way of kind of repairing and restoring some of that. But it seems to have rather gone the other way. And it doesn't feel like we're in particularly good shape at the moment. That said, Biden's election has changed things. There is a sense of momentum. I'm very interested in your thoughts about the future of the West and this idea of the Liberal Alliance, and how the next year or two in the pandemic recovery is going to be bearing down on that. And I think there were quite a few references to the context that is specific to the pandemic in the review, but at the same time, it was also trying to pull us out of that paradigm. Where do you see the future of the left, the future of Liberal Alliance? Is it still fit for purpose moving forward? Where do we need to be directing our attentions, and particularly the global Britain that is set out in this review? How should we be thinking of our leadership role as we move forward out of the pandemic? So in terms of the global pandemic recovery. So Gisela, back to you.
Well, I mean, the first thing to remember is that we're still right in the midst of it. And I think that when we do emerge from this, which will take much longer than any of us anticipate, each country will reflect and find that with hindsight, there's certain things they wish they had done differently, and certain things they wish they hadn't done at all. So any kind of gloating on any side at this stage is just don't go there, is my advice. We will also, as we emerge from that, learn that our international supply chains are exceptionally complicated. I mean, if you were to follow through as to what the current production problems in India are, it's a reflection of those complicated supply chains, all of which at the end of the day rely on complying with an international rule of law. So I would anybody remind them that any kind of sort of vaccine nationalism, which goes beyond contractual obligations, becomes very, very tricky. I think it will also have reminded ourselves that we all need to talk about what are critical infrastructure capacities, that there's certain kind of capabilities you need to make sure you have at home, because they are important. But what I think, if I almost draw an analogy, because the one criticism, or the one thing about the integrated review is how much focus, or could there have been more focus on the environment, just as what I hope we will have learned from dealing with COVID equally applies on anything to do with the global environment. Friend or foe, they will be part of the solution. And we I hope that we kind of look at what works in this kind of relationships, even when they're adversarial in other aspects. We work together, and I think that's why COP in autumn, I think is a real challenge, or is a real challenge, opportunity, or opportunity to fail, and I hope we don't, for the UK, to actually demonstrate what global Britain means. I think that is such a moment where we can do it, and that brings COVID and the environment together.
Thank you, Gisela. Simon.
Well, clearly, I mean, COVID is going to change many things in the world, both domestically and internationally. We don't know exactly how that's going to look. But at the moment, we are, you know, as Gisela has said, we're at the very height of an acute competition for a scarce resource, which we all need, which is the vaccine. I hope that this will be a short-term thing. I think it's really important that, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll get over it. But of course, distributing vaccine is not only an issue for the rich countries, it's also about the fair distribution of those vaccines to other countries. So that is a very big challenge. But on your broader question about the future of the West, I mean, I think that's a very important, this is a very important moment. I mean, the best thing that's happened for the future of the West is the defeat of Donald Trump. And the victory of Joe Biden. Now, that may not be a lasting thing. It's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge, and we have to respond to that opportunity. And I think that we should be investing hard, as indeed this review is, therefore, in the relationship with the United States more generally, and in, you know, collaboration in support of liberal internationalist values. That is why I'm concerned about the acute downturn in the political relationship between the UK and the EU, because we are allies, we do share values, we are liberal democracies, well-established liberal democracies, and we should be working together. So we do, as it goes back to my earlier point, you know, we need to overcome that in order to be credible. And this is all part of facing up in the discussion of values to the China, which is identified as an increasingly powerful competitor in the review. I think we also need to expand this concept of the West. I'm quite in favour of the ideas of the British government that we try to develop the relationships with other democracies. You know, obviously, you know, Australia, the Republic of Korea, India, and others, and that we go beyond just the sort of confines of the Euro-Atlantic alliance to build relationships around the world, and that's part of the Indo-Pacific tilt, and I'm supportive of that. But what I don't think we should do is think that post-Brexit we can substitute old relationships with new relationships. In other words, we shouldn't be building up, you know, turning to India and thinking that if we build a relationship with India, we can forget about the other Europeans. We can't. We need them all. You need your old friends, and you need to develop your relationships with your new friends, and that's the way I think we should think about the evolution of the so-called West.
Yes, indeed. Well, of course, the review is, I would say, rather unusual in its focus on us expressing our power and influence in a very collaborative way. And I think that the key line is, you know, we will lead where it makes sense for us to do so. And I think particularly, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific, I think this emphasis on us aligning ourselves with existing alliances and structures that are already there rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, I think is rather interesting. But this takes us very neatly, and I'm trying to wrap up as many questions as possible, and I'm thinking that a very neat way for us to do this is to ask about the G7, which of course you mentioned India, you know, South Korea, Australia as well, are being asked to, they've been invited by the United Kingdom to join the G7 meeting, which we of course are hosting here in Cornwall in June. It's a huge moment for global Britain to sort of really put our cards on the table, and it's obviously going to be a really important precursor to the COP26 summit as well. I would love to hear from you both as your final thoughts about a couple of things you think should be the priorities for the UK to try and achieve out of that G7 summit. So commitments to X and Y, formation of new alliances, positioning on this, you know, coming together on this. I'd love to hear what you think the key agenda items should be for the UK to get out of that very important moment. Gisela.
I still vividly remember when the G7 in was 97, 98 came to Birmingham, and we all were in a symphony hall, and I saw the world leaders bobbing along to singing Beatles songs, and it kind of and Bill Clinton holding a pint of beer in Birmingham, and the point of that is that the G7 coming to the UK at that time was an incredibly important domestic issue as well. Now, unfortunately, because of COVID, we won't be able to have that kind of exposure. But it is important to make it as relevant. Again, it comes back to what BFPG has been doing for a long time, that to make that event relevant to the UK, because they can actually see people, and it comes ahead of then popped in the autumn. The three things which is sort of keywords which I would say we ought to remember. One is COVID should have given us the opportunity to, whenever anybody says, but this is how we used to do it, to say, yes, but we don't do it like that anymore. You know, it's forced us to do it there. So be quite brave. The second one is just take the globe and tilt it a little bit. In this occasion, not to the Indo-Pacific, but actually to the north, in terms of just showing how with global warming and Arctic trade routes opening, that maybe, and again for the United Kingdom, in that context, to sort of realize that Scotland is important to us, also in this contribution to our security. And the next one is, the final one is to say, you know, it's good to start with G7, but actually, given that a lot of our world institutions are so frozen and just as the reviews with the United Nations, you know, sort of just never go anywhere, use the opportunity of meetings like that, where you can expand the circle of people to be invited to actually break down some of the older barriers. So I think it was right to extend the invitation list.
Thank you, Gisela. Simon.
Well, I think what I'd say is I would caution against putting too much emphasis on one specific event, because these summits come and go, and once they've happened, and actually there's a limit to what you can do on the day. So I think we should be looking at the G7 as part of the sequence of developing Britain's engagement and influence on the back of this document, G7 through the G20, into the COP and beyond, and then thinking about future organization of international institutions, which is another theme in the review. So that's my first point. Let's not overemphasize one day. Having said that, I do think on the issues like sustainable trade, climate change, the international vaccine policy, international health, those are issues where, entirely in keeping with the spirit of this review, and indeed what Britain has been doing already, we can use the G7, I think, to mobilize and galvanize activity. But it's got to be, you know, it's about kicking things off and catalyzing things which then happen through other institutions and in other ways over time around the world. And so I think that's how we should think about it. And I think also it's very important for Britain in terms of how we position ourselves. This has been a slightly UK-centric discussion. We haven't asked ourselves how other people are looking at this review and how other countries will see it. But I think that actually the review is being seen internationally as quite a credible piece of work. Countries which may have thought that Britain has slightly got off the rails in recent years will be looking at this and saying, well, you know, are they now sort of, you know, setting out a clear direction? And I think if we take the G7 with a sort of air of humility, not, you know, world beating this, world beating that, but, you know, Britain contributing in a systematic way to shared objectives and exercising our leverage and being realistic about what we can do and how we need to work with others, then it's a big opportunity to be the first moment at which we begin to put this agenda into practice.
Thank you, Simon. A very powerful defense of the medium is the message. I'm so grateful to both of you for your time, and I'm so grateful to the audience for submitting all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone individually, but I hope everyone feels they've had something touched upon today. We'll of course be doing loads more at the BFPG on the integrated review, and particularly as we move into that implementation phase. I will just highlight two pieces of work coming up that might be relevant to some of the conversations we've had today. First, we've got a new piece of work coming out soon, looking at the UK population as foreign policy tribes. So segmenting all of the big database we've had from our public opinion surveys, so you can better understand what the electoral dynamics of our foreign policy attitudes look like. We also have a new paper coming out soon on the intersection of levelling up and global Britain, something very dear to our hearts, and which we are delighted to have seen as a very central axis within the review. So all that's left for me to do is thank you very much, Simon, thank you very much, Gisela, and thank you to the audience, and we look forward to seeing you very soon at the British Foreign Policy Group.